While the catastrophic apocalypse of the Horus Heresy may have ended more than 10,000 years ago, it also remains, in many ways, a conflict that has never truly ended. The Imperium may have painfully moved on to where those events, sacrifices, and battles of legend have now become myth. The Emperor's mortal wounding aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the annihilation of entire worlds, the devastation of legions, and conflicts between Titan legios, most of humanity's future being incinerated in galactic fire. We return to my, in quotes, beginners series on the ASTARTES and now the Traitor ASTARTES. However, as is typical for me, things might have gotten slightly carried away, especially with the word bearers, hence this episode will focus on 2 of the remaining 4 legions. Because when it comes to the Undivided, I think there's generally more to discuss or at least think about than some of those others, because those who pledge themselves to the likes of Khorne, Nurgle and so on, they tend to have a more singular, more binary outlook to their activities. So today we'll focus on the Word Bearers and the Iron Warriors. But, just to ask, do you think that the Night Lords, for example, carry as much of a threat for devastation as the Word Bearers? Do you think the Iron Warriors achieve more constructive objectives to bring Guilliman low than the Alpha Legion? Tell me in the comments below. So to begin with my usual too long introduction. In the last Traitors video we spoke to the disintegration of the legions somewhat, but when it comes to the Undivided, considering this is more important, and we can talk about that more specifically in each section as well. Where I wanted to start is in trying to imagine how difficult it is to truly conceptualize how much time has passed since the Heresy. It's 10,000 years, but few of us can, with really any sincerity, imagine what even several centuries feels like, let alone 1,000 years. 10,000 is really beyond human comprehension. From our perspective, 10,000 years ago means humans living in small hunter-gatherer based communities. Around that time, some were cultivating grain, starting the domestication of animals, but this was long before the emergence of things like cities, states, kings, even written language. Now, in your head, you may have a picture of what that looks like, but to imagine the transformative passage of 100 centuries is outside of our ability to realistically conceive. For the Imperium in that time span, innumerable human civilizations have risen, flourished, and disappeared. They may have been swallowed by the void, lost to annihilation by failures in the bureaucratic labyrinth of the Imperial Administratum. Trillions have lived and died, with most only ever knowing scant, rumoured details of the greatest civil war in human history. Hive citizens, they rely on mere scraps of incomplete scripture, rumours, stories, dulled frescoes, heavily polluted stained glass windows. Upon shrine worlds, perhaps once in a lifetime they might see some faded records or bear witness to ambiguous relics that are on public display, but the purpose for those objects is likely unknowable. We're talking about an unimaginative audience who struggle to comprehend what they're really seeing. So the core of humanity as it stands can never hope to actually picture what took place in those desperate times on Terra during the last days of the Heresy. Most citizens are reliant upon the self-serving sermons of the Ministorum, which are repeated and embellished so much that what were perhaps once something approximating a one-to-one account of recorded actions by crusade remembrancers are now all but religious fiction. For the citizenry, that of course remains indistinguishable from the truth, because what lowly hive scrubber would dare to challenge the word of the ecclesiarchy? Anybody with half a brain would know that only an inferno of purification or chapel servitor conversion would await. Even amongst the Astartes themselves, Primaris or otherwise, with the advent of the Era Indomitus, the Heresy is remembered as the mythical deeds of ancestors, the larger-than-life warriors who fought beside the Primarchs in the final hours. These are figures of legend spoken about with reverence as heroes of ancient terror. Only those who are entombed within the sacred sarcophagi of dreadnoughts may still live to speak of such times, shielded from the ravages of entropy within their stasis vaults. emerging rarely throughout the centuries to speak a few words of inspiration and perhaps shockingly grounded history that may be cherished or even cause trouble by any who hear their words. So human life in M41 is entirely unrecognisable to those who lived in the age of the Heresy. For those who betrayed the Emperor, things are markedly different, because their war never ended, and many remain trapped in this prison of their own making, because those who could not move forward remained tethered to the torment of that fateful battle for terror, whether they realise it or not. We know all too well that the Immaterium does not measure time as the material galaxy does. Within its inexplicably shifting tides, days, months or centuries may pass, even as millennia shift in its mirror of real space. It's been commonly documented how a Chaos warband may emerge believing, from their perspective, that only centuries have passed since the Siege of Terror, leading to often disturbing and sobering prospects when the traitors discover that the Imperium they sought to overthrow has not only endured for 10,000 years, but dug in ever more firmly to its territory, now wielding weapons and tools of war entirely unknown to them. For other traitor Astartes, the time distortion can be the polar opposite. They may emerge from the warp as seen by those living in real space many times over a single century, but for the traitors, their experience of time is far more mind-bending. For each time they vanish into the warp, they may remain there for what feels like thousands of years, before finally finding their way back out and an escape that allows them to return into the Materium, confusingly not long after they departed. Both of these scenarios can have very bizarre benefits or more negative consequence. An Imperial world, for example, may struggle to comprehend how a Chaos force could be devastated so successfully only to emerge a relatively short time later entirely renewed. On the other side, a Chaos warband may struggle to ever gain purchase on their new reality, finding time to have shifted so significantly that each time they return to reality, the Imperial defenders are again fully reinforced, making any solid objective plans almost impossible. At a personal level, all of this only serves to profoundly exacerbate the delusion, insanity and twisted distortion of the minds of the traitor Marines. They can struggle to place themselves in even the most basic of physical parameters. Cause and effect can blur, while memory becomes steadily impossible to separate from illusion or dream. In some respects, we might consider how those who gave themselves fully to the great gods of chaos have in fact fared better from the perspective of their relative individual sanity, for they at least may have largely lost their mind immediately and thus are unable to perceive such mind-distorting concepts, or they now exist in a state of such singular focus that any past notions of memory or communication are all but meaningless. I've often considered how some of the traitor Astartes likely still remember the Emperor, having walked beside him, marched upon lost planets beneath the banners of unity, standing shoulder to shoulder with legions that would one day become their mortal enemies. They remember the Crusade not as mythical imaginings as do Imperial Astartes, but as lived experience. They remember their Primarchs not as demonically empowered idols, but as grounded commanders whose voices echoed across the cargo bays of flagships. They carry this with them, and I always imagine how it could or must remain a point of weakness for some among their number, because these are the individuals who fought for Terror and Horus, who battered and bludgeoned their way through the bloodiest, most hate-fueled war imaginable, and that hatred has never been allowed to fade. At the same time, they have to face reality. Inevitably, their numbers have been thinned over the millennia, and so while there are those who have inherited this hatred for humanity, for me, the more interesting question of those heresy veterans is not just how they fared since their survival, it's more what did that survival cost them. We know in the previous episode for this series, having explored how the Chaos Gods shaped traitor legions, that pride, despair, rage and ambition became the instruments through which those unbreakable brotherhoods were unmade, yet whenever it comes to gaining the blessings of the Dark Gods, there is always a price to be paid. The Death Guard sacrificed their physical forms, now twisted and bloated beyond recognition, Among the World Eaters, they suffered a near loss of all comprehension, replaced by an unending thirst for blood and rage-induced slaughter. Yet despite this, the galaxy of M41 is not singularly defined by the will of the gods. It has been shaped just as profoundly by the philosophies of those who chose to wield the power of chaos without surrendering entirely to it. Over 10,000 years, the traitors who left the heresy with little to show superficially for their treachery became reshaped each according to their own path. Some surrendered entirely to mutation, degenerating into little more than monstrous extensions of the immaterium. Most notably, the word-bearers transformed their utter disillusionment into a powerful belief that has driven them to becoming the great prophets of the warp. They carry the word of the faithful across the entire galaxy and use the powers they are able to harness to unlock profound horrors and devastation upon mortal humanity. The Iron Warriors were another of those who significantly resisted the worst distortions offered by the warp and instead continued to rely upon their engineering and tactical capabilities, paired with the complete abandonment of all moral decency. In collaboration with many of the Dark Mechanicum, for example, they became experts in wielding engines of war suitable for demons to become bound within their chambers, as readily as they might otherwise flesh and blood. As a force, they remained the masters of attritional warfare and relentless siegecraft, but they're now bolstered by practices so abhorrent that while resisting the more pure allegiances to the warp, they in no way shied away from delivering the reality of chaos upon those who inhabit real space, and now find themselves experiencing those hellscape worlds such as Medrengard. So the Imperium had survived to begin its hunt for the traitors, whose dream of rebellion and securing total power now lay in tattered ruins. In the scouring which followed, by every measure of history, the legions could have fractured totally into scattered bands of raiders, clinging to fading sanity and the drifting memories of a lost age. And that did occur, by degrees. But I think it would be more true to say that the traitors managed to retain a considerable level of unity, albeit on a sliding scale, legion-dependent. The why of this is quite obvious, really, which is to say that each was forced, willing or not, to face the same existential question. What path remains open to you when everything you fought for now stands to be lost or destroyed? Any answers found would be entirely subjective to both their legion and personal circumstance. Some found faith and a renewed sense of purpose, others indulged themselves in meaningless, all-consuming war. There were those who found themselves needing some sense of structure that would allow them to define this new reality, or at least their perception of it. The means by which any revelations were to be achieved were often through inflicting appalling horror upon Imperial worlds, and then there were those who simply vanished inward behind veils of secrecy, their intentions indistinguishable from rumour or myth. There were traitor Astartes who emerged from the heresy in an uncommitted state, perhaps not yet ready to commit fully to the Undivided, only to find themselves over the years being condemned by the Imperium to the point they drifted toward temptations of specific chaos worship, but still resisted giving themselves openly. Broadly, the traitor Marines allowed their bodies to become physically ravaged by the warp powers. Many would even share their physical form with those entities who dwell in darkness, gifting them superior strength, speed or resilience in return. But there were always those traitors among the Undivided who appeared unusually neutral in their outward appearance, often no different than had they just departed terror from the final battle. How they changed post-heresy became one of their greatest weaknesses, but also one of their greatest strengths. For some of their number, gone were now the large armies that had marched beneath unified banners during the Crusade and Heresy. In their place emerged thousands of independently operating warbands, each with its own ambitions and, most critically, no longer requiring a unified strategic command. Any traitor Astartes could found a new warband, as all answered only to themselves. Displays of strength and leadership were most often all that were required. And while some were more unified than others, that fragmentation of individual warbands really applied to all of the Undivided traitors. In some respects, I would argue it was quite comparable to the way orcs choose their leaders, or more specifically, whoever can give the best head smashing calls the shots. which I think was perfectly illustrated in one of the most recent novels, Archmagos, where we saw an Iron Warriors warband struggling to retain leadership over one another and making some pretty extreme decisions because they were just terrified they were all going to turn on one another. Also, incidentally, it's not commonly reported upon, but there are loyalist Astartes who break away without becoming full traitors. They remain technically loyalist, but these renegades found themselves, for whatever reason, feeling alienated, unable to serve in the traditional sense. Most often that's due to having become disillusioned by the Imperium or some specific related personal event, orders that got their entire company killed, and so on. And whilst not literal traitors, they are treated as such, obviously, by the true loyalists, as inevitably over time they know that they will tend to find themselves slowly, even unwittingly, twisted by the whispered seductions of the warp, or perhaps simple necessity. Some might see themselves in the same way as radical inquisitors, that they have to use certain powers as a means to an end. But others who isolate themselves in disgrace may choose to seclude themselves on fringe rimworlds or feral planets. The most Puritan and stalwart commit themselves to crusades which see them face impossible odds, lending their strength to bolster, say, the dying spirit of Imperial worlds before they're scoured from existence by alien horrors. And I mention these small groups of renegades only because when it comes to the legions of traitors Undivided, their numbers can vary wildly. Traitor warbands may number among a few individuals, tens or hundreds of marines. They launch raids from ancient strike cruisers, forgotten fortress worlds that have even been seen to repurpose space hulks. And so it's important just to know that in addition to the chapters, the legions, all of these larger forces, throughout the galaxy there are all sorts of individual small groups all over the place, all doing their own different things for their own agenda, which is pretty interesting to think about. But importantly, many of these traitor warbands do not wield significant hardware for obvious reasons. They're often barely able to scrape together a few tanks or thunderhawks. The capacity to, for example, have a dreadnought on hand would remain entirely dependent on wherever they call home and its facilities. So most warbands therefore exist as little more than clandestine brotherhoods, embedding agents within Imperial institutions and patiently orchestrating the collapse of worlds over generations. But their size does not equate necessarily to their effectiveness. A single traitor Astartes can bring down a world. They may begin by arriving to turn a few citizens, engaging then further cultists who seek to empower themselves or see some promise within. They lay deep in the darkest corners of a hive city, content to allow their human agents to progressively weaken and test the waters. Should certain actions fail, their agents die, they can just repeat and go again. Finally, they may emerge at the head of a cultist militant force, unleashing sabotage and a wave of destruction which gains such momentum it cannot be contained. But more problematic for the Loyalists were the fact that the traitors now were without this singular command structure, and thus became ever more unpredictable. Without an identifiable figure or like a Primarch to base assumptions of potential actions around or place counter-assault units based on historical strategy, the arrival of a traitor force in system would always become deeply concerning. Why were they here? What strength of material did they bring with them? And where and when would they strike first? It's also important to remember that a lot of Imperial worlds have never seen Space Marines before, and so the difference between a traitor and a loyalist may not be that easy to differentiate, and this is something that, for example, like the Alpha Legion will exploit continuously. They will arrive on a planet, start heading towards a hive city, and announce that maybe the governor is a traitor or something along these lines, immediately throwing into chaos all of the defense systems so that by the time they roll up on a city, it's too late and they can really take advantage of that. But this unintended decentralization is really key in understanding the Undivided Legions, because their shattering transformed the nature of the Long War. While technically some still retain a homeworld, in reality the Imperium could no longer hope to destroy a single capital, eliminate a supreme commander, or force a decisive surrender and expect this to carry any significant meaning. Even the eradication of a traitor Primarch would be questionable as to how much impact this would really have in the bigger picture. While those who had aligned themselves totally behind their god of choice could still arrive in force more akin to the legions of old, Any such arrival, whilst terrifying, could still be faced down and driven into by a direct and substantial counter-offensive. Whereas with those of the Undivided, each time a warband is broken, sure, there may be no damaging impact to Imperial structures on that day, but the defeat of one will often simply give space and oxygen for another to rise, or its survivors may further fragment into smaller but equally critical conflicts. By comparison, those who have managed to retain significant unity like the Iron Warriors and the Word Bearers hold such immense bastions which exist within the Eye of Terror. Any Imperial conquest other than, say, a vast Crusade fleet by Guilliman or the Lion, anything less than that is going to be unsuccessful, other than perhaps specific strike missions to infiltrate and so on. But of those Undivided Legions who retained their collective strength, they could still sometimes bring about a conflagration that would see entire systems fall beneath their march once more. The question was, why to do that, and when would be the best opportunity? They are well aware that the Imperium is vast and that they have to choose their specific moments to strike out, or otherwise effectively will fail still. So there are a significant number of traitors who still serve figures of renown like Abaddon or Perturabo, but generally speaking their new and far more chaotic structure left them forced to tailor and switch up their approach towards smaller engagements, but positively now this left them almost impossible to fully eradicate. Until recently in M41, largely gone across the last 10,000 years had been these structured campaigns of mass annihilation. Only the likes of Abaddon and his Black Crusades could indulge in such grandiose affairs, their lackluster impact standing to the amusement and relish of other legions, roundly mocking their failure to bring about any significant damage or change to the Imperium. Of course, that mockery went more quiet when the emergence of the Great Rift arrived and Abaddon's grand plan was revealed. But for most of the Undivided warbands, the Long War takes the form of not these immense campaigns, but battles of opportunity and conflicts of exploitation. A planet, say, left unmonitored, is ravaged for resources, key forge worlds descended upon by several warbands, and a combined objective to strip all usable hardware and most often the precious archived knowledge. I think that one of the most common misunderstandings surrounding the Traitor Legions, but especially those who position themselves as aligning with Chaos Undivided, is that they do not exist as a single collective enemy. I think the confusion arises in regard to that because of how they're represented within the tabletop game. Because in that arena there's no real sense that anything ever changed at a superficial level between the Heresy and M41. Hey, you're taking Alpha Legion, you're taking Night Lords, you can have as many tanks and things like that as you want. Some of the legions who survived are stronger than others, and in actuality those who survived that span mostly now exist as groups who share overlapping conflicts. Their only true unity exists in the form of their absolute hatred toward the Imperium and of course the Emperor. However, something their powers combined, they become the Warp's greatest champion, gathering beneath a common banner or objective to inflict sustained immense damage, at least comparative to their lesser, more typical campaigns. And despite the mockery by his contemporaries, it is of course Abaddon of the Black Legion who has achieved more than any other, utilising alliances of convenience, but which are of course invariably temporary. The same problems that broke the legions in the Heresy now still persist as well for the Traitors. Internal rivalries, all-consuming egos and unbreakable pride, even more simply just the conflicting ambitions. The Traitors find themselves consumed by these endless disagreements, how best to inflict the most damage against their common enemy, and it is this which endlessly threatens to pull them apart and diminish their strength once more. They don't have a singular commander like the Imperium has in Guilliman. They are constantly fighting among themselves for strength, superiority, success, and basically bragging rights. So from the perspective of the Imperium, problematic as they are, the Undivided Legions are a bizarre mixture of laughably unfocused efforts or an almost imperceptible blade which whirls around threatening to bleed you by 10,000 cuts. In many respects, the conclusion of those with the authority to see the greater picture is that the onslaught of traitors is an impossible war to win. The best you can hope for is to hold back the tide, because like embers carried upon the wind, each fire may be beaten out, appearing insignificant in isolation, but if one ember survives to raise a new fire, it can spread to more and more until together they form an enveloping wall of fire which can burn to the ground even the most well-prepared Imperial bastions. The Long War has therefore always represented something more insidious than just an endless military campaign. I'm quite certain the Imperium would welcome that over what it faces in actuality, that being the slow corrosion of Imperial certainty, just as was seen during the Heresy itself. Wherever faith and vigilance falter, cults and rebellions will exploit that vacuum. For chaos, even those of the Undivided no longer dominate by might alone. For much like the Xenos Tyrannid, they conquer as would a disease wrought upon a planetary population. They burrow into the hearts of Imperial life and threaten to devour it from within, or through despicable ceremonies of pain and cruelty unleash forces of the most abhorrent form and intention. Our first of the remaining 4 Undivided to complete this series now is of course one of my favourites, and a legion whom I feel have always been poorly represented. At the same time, when you have a Primarch who has unlocked such power that he can kill with just a gaze, I don't feel that marks them out as weak or unsuccessful. In fact, I think it would be fair to say that in the grand scheme of things, few legions have left deeper scars upon the Imperium than the Wordbearers. For unlike those, such as the World Eaters, whose atrocities are written in oceans of blood, or the Death Guard, whose coming is heralded by vast miasmas of plague and decay, the victories of the 17th Legion are far more unremarked, yet often considerably more devastating. A Wordbearer's incursion could begin as something entirely ordinary, a text passed between hands enrobed in shadow, a desperate soul searching for meaning amidst the endless suffering of the Underhive. A disenfranchised noble discovers a stranger with particularly persuasive perspectives. In the months that pass, a panicked governor tries to get control of the unfolding situation by sending in ever stronger waves of planetary militia, yet by the time the first bolt shell echoes through the public square, the war has already been lost by the Imperials, and the prophet of the 17th is content to sit back and watch yet another world burn, with themselves having barely fired a shot. This is perhaps the greatest distinction of the Wordbearers. They have never believed that wars are won solely upon the battlefield. Historically, they always demonstrated the understanding that an idea or belief can possess a far greater fire and endurance than any army. For while cities may be destroyed, fleets annihilated, and entire system structures collapse, belief can survive them all. Even before Lorgar was reunited with his legion, the 17th had served as the Imperial Heralds, carrying the Emperor's message to newly compliant worlds. Except that this was true of all the legions. They carried the Imperial truth and his message of compliance. The difference was the fact that the Wordbearers never saw their role as one of being merely conquest. They remained with this more significant presence upon planets that they occupied. Even after the fleet had departed, they would spend time rebuilding societies, educating populations, ensuring that Imperial authority would endure without disquiet or rebellion. Where other legions measured their success by the number of worlds brought into compliance, those planets' strength of loyalty could be entirely variable. Often it was held in place by a tenuous agreement that only endured due to the promise of annihilation should they rebel. By contrast, the 17th sought to transform the perspectives of a compliant world totally. They believed victory was only complete once hearts and minds had accepted their new order, which in many respects was actually an accurate and constructive perspective. But it was not the Emperor's intention for such efforts to occur in the Crusade. Some worlds welcomed the legions, others resisted, but in its totality all he required was subjugation, and that need not necessarily mean a smooth, willing acceptance of Imperial order. So when Lorgar was reunited with his legion upon Colchis, he was at this point already effectively seen as a divine entity by his followers. So inevitably, thereafter, the instruction of the 17th changed still further. Their duty of carrying the Emperor's message to newly compliant worlds remained, with their insistence on ensuring a population's ideological outlook aligned with that of the Imperial truth. So far, so good. The significant change was that with Lorgar now in charge, his view was that a civilization could only truly survive if it possessed a shared spiritual purpose. This was the core of his belief system emergent from his time spent on cultures, and so the Legion inevitably devoted as much effort to shaping the beliefs of a world as it did to prosecuting war. The fact that the Emperor had always espoused a strict enforcement of an atheistic meritocratic ideology was effectively interpreted by Lorgar and others as merely the Emperor's denial of his own divinity. They had to prove to him that they understood his real message, in quotes. And so, unlike his brother Primarchs, Lorgar viewed the Emperor as not merely the greatest ruler humanity had ever produced, but as the one true divine being, a singular centre for human belief, the God Emperor of mankind. Across hundreds of compliant worlds, magnificent cities, temples and monuments were to be raised in his honour, all of which meant for very slow progress in converting planets for the Word-bearers. This was also the period where Lorgar would complete his work known as the Lectitio Divinitatis. In effect, this was his own holy book, which would hold supreme religious authority over its followers. Of course, comically, this became the foundation of all imperial religion, including the branch which would form the contemporary ecclesiarchy in the aftermath of the apostasy. Lorgar's work was complete before he turned to chaos, and its presence is already clearly evident in the latter period of the Crusade. It appears early into the Heresy series, and even Malcador said when evidence of religious cults were emerging that these believers are little more than groups of worried people drawing solace from the pages of a fanatic's scribblings, which was surely an unfortunate choice of words for a faith which would ultimately play a significant role in the final act of Great War upon Terror. But this is why the Word-bearers are a uniquely intriguing traitor legion. Without them, it's questionable as to if the Imperium would have survived the Heresy, let alone through to M41. But in saying that, it's also questionable without the Word-bearers should the Heresy have happened at all. Lorgar's early belief and devotion to the Emperor stands even now as the origin of his empowering and potential rising in M41. There are even those such as Guilliman, unbelievably, who with everything they've witnessed in the era Indomitus now have begun to question some of their deepest and unmovable beliefs, with the Primarch of the Ultramarines even possessing an early original copy of his brother's greatest work, and the less Puritan Inquisitors who know about that, certainly the better. The Word-bearers, of course, infamously suffered one of the greatest humiliations inflicted by the Emperor upon any of his legions or Primarchs. When after much investigation as to why the Word-bearers were taking so much longer than other legions to progress their campaigns of imperial compliance, the ultimate truth revealed an unbearable outrage. As the Word-bearers' crusade had effectively formed a proto-religion around the Emperor, and understandably this was entirely intolerable. The Emperor had intended to correct his most devout legion by demonstrating to them the futility of their efforts, and thereby force them back toward the only remaining reality, that of the imperial truth. I suppose much as he had done during the unification, battering people into submission, demonstrating that his will couldn't be withstood, and so he remains the only option left, all others having been eliminated, and lastly to very visually crush any sense of religious reverence. So his order for the Ultramarines Legion to raise and scour the jewel of the Word-bearers' campaigns of compliance was not well received. Monarchia burned, and any idea held by the Emperor for this to brutally enable the 17th to start anew with a clean slate were severely misplaced. His decision, perhaps obviously, achieved precisely the opposite. Even before the ashes of Monarchia had fully cooled, the Word-bearers had drifted off into a state of complete and total malaise. They could not simply wipe clean and start again. They were absolutely despondent. The Emperor's actions had caused them to enter into a full-blown identity crisis and crisis of faith. They now had no idea what they were supposed to do. They were humiliated and disillusioned. So this misplaced action on behalf of the Emperor would in fact become the foundation upon which the entire Horus Heresy would be built. Lorgar did not abandon his search for divinity, perhaps entirely unsurprisingly. He simply concluded that he had been worshipping the wrong god all along, and therefore was very unhappy about this. And this is likely where I need to interject a small word about one of the greatest figures in 40k, first chaplain of the Wordbearers, an apostle, Erebus. Now generally people seem to hate Erebus, and I can appreciate that, but I think it delivers him a great disservice. For Erebus, above all others, is the true origin of the heresy itself. And this is another opportunity for me to remind you all that some of the greatest revelations of 40k lore occur not in the major novels, but in short stories, often of the heresy. The one we need to be concerned with is Child of Chaos. It tells the origin of Erebus, and I don't want to spoil it all because it's a dark, captivating short, but essentially Erebus was a child of Colchis, the planet where Lorgar was found, and seemingly he was always deeply disturbed to an almost comical degree. And I've said before now that I dislike the overuse of the term evil because it often gives unnecessary immoral validation to those who have done wrong when they should be held accountable for their conscious actions. Just saying, oh, someone did so-and-so because they were evil, and it's like, well no, let's look at the specific circumstances. Erebus, however, was truly evil. He was a completely immoral monster from seemingly birth, and I personally even question if the warp didn't have some hand there in his creation, which to be clear is entirely my own speculation. So when young Erebus was inducted as an aspiring priest upon Colchis for the Covenant, that was a religious faction upon the world, he would one day catch sight of his face reflected in a broken mirror, interestingly broken 4 ways, and there he realised that those of the warp had always been with him. I also recommend Lorgar's origin book Bearer of the Word, also set on Colchis. It starts off slow, but it's really a very enjoyable story and allows you to see Lorgar in quite a different light. And thus, in mentioning Erebus, I should also mention another important figure for the Wordbearers, Corphaeron. He was Lorgar's adoptive father. Now, unusually for the Astartes, Corphaeron is something of a ridiculous figure, and whenever in the lore someone has a background as a kind of ridiculous figure, I often can kind of tone that down, walk it back, rationalise it a little bit, but Corphaeron is a ridiculous figure. But he was also the man who discovered Lorgar and taught him the ways of belief. Their stories unfold in Bearer of the Word, but what was interesting about him is that when Lorgar rejoined the Legion, Corphaeron was too old to become a true space marine. Nevertheless, he was adapted to wear power armour. Yet even thereafter still was mocked and derided for being basically a sickly old man and entirely undeserving of the privileges afforded to him by the Primarch, which was certainly true. At the same time, Corphaeron shouldn't be so easily dismissed on appearance alone later in time, because one of the very core things about the Wordbearers is that spirit and willpower rise above all other things, and Corphaeron has that in almost limitless levels. He is absolutely psychotic when it comes to the ideas of his religion and spirit and willpower and what must be done to others to make them believe. And so what do you think happens when you have a figure whose willpower rises above all others and the forces of chaos behind them to imbue them with strength? It's not a good result or anybody that you should want to be mocking, because Cor, like Erebus, was an extremely cruel individual, so that by the time the powers of chaos had begun to imbue himself and Erebus, he was already far more deadly than he appeared. One small example, he laid low Guilliman. Admittedly, and at the time, ignorant of the warp Guilliman, but nonetheless. And also Guilliman did batter him into submission and rip out one of his hearts, but still, Corphaeron's influence alongside Erebus would then see Lorgar eventually place his faith in the warp gods. And I think it's debatable that had it been Erebus alone, whether he would have been so easily convinced. But with Corphaeron, it made it an almost inevitable conclusion that Lorgar was going to turn. So in M41, Corphaeron remains this powerful force as first captain and a Dark Cardinal within the Legion, and sees their objectives less in destroying the Imperium than of course converting and corrupting it. Anyway, The more important thing is that Erebus was this meticulous puppet master, a truly evil figure even before he became a follower of Lorgar. And although I'm sure there are some who would even question if Erebus is a true follower and not just seeing Lorgar as a means to an end, he's an absolutely essential component of the fall and the heresy. But in talking about the origin of kind of chaos worship, you might wonder how typical was it upon many human planets during the Crusade era for chaos to be worshipped unwittingly or otherwise? And the answer is actually pretty typical, because many cultures just saw that worship yielding them literal power without any real understanding of why. Few were capable of genuinely understanding just what chaos was, and so often there might be priests, shamans, witches, sorcerers who might see themselves imbued with certain powers, and they just got their own names for whatever that is. They see that by carrying out abhorrent ceremonies involving suffering, execution, so on, it gave them power, and so they believed in the spirituality, the worship of this. But it also meant they were carrying out activities that were just complete travesties to all human morality. And it was only figures such as Erebus who came to the understanding of what they truly promised. Consequently, he began to formulate how things needed to progress. So even before he was converted to an Astartes alongside Lorgar's faithful of Colchis, Erebus was effectively an agent of chaos. So that by the time the word-bearers were reeling in this depressed, disillusioned state in the aftermath of Monarchia, it was entirely obvious how things were going to go. Erebus corrupted the Legion, and its ultimate impact is already told to us through the Heresy. Also, if you want to read about Lorgar's subsequent pilgrimage, you're looking for the spectacular First Heretic, and after that a novella, Aurelian. Essentially, we see Lorgar encounter the Eye of Terror. He's guided by a demon through the revelation of the primordial truth, which then leads, of course, to the corruption of Horus. But always important to remember, if you're new, the timeline of events through the Heresy is all over the place. There isn't a straight continuity through all of the books. Anyway, these events would ultimately transform not just the 17th, but also, of course, humanity's destiny for the coming 10,000 years. And I think you might say that that's not too shabby for a legion often cast to the sidelines in terms of their perceived importance. Truly though, I've always thought that the Emperor's greatest error was not in denying his own divinity. It was that he believed divinity itself could just be discarded, something that calls us back to the last church and his apparent flippant disregard for how heavily humanity has relied upon some form of spirituality throughout basically its entire history. And this is something I've discussed before, but as this is meant to be a beginner's series, I think you can attribute the Emperor thinking humanity would just abandon religion to either bad writing, a flawed, overconfident character, or my preference, which is that the Emperor, having lived and emerged through the other side of humanity's golden zenithal age, likely saw what humanity was capable of, and simply made an overly optimistic judgment that given how much time had passed, it should still be possible to return to that ideological position. But he was, of course, severely wrong. His imperial truth sought to build a civilization founded entirely upon reason, where superstition would wither beneath enlightenment, and mankind would stand free from irrational fears that had dominated the old night, the age of strife. And again, this is likely why he didn't think it was necessary to talk to the Primarchs about chaos and the warp. But while the Emperor might have held that view, the word-bearers were left to conclude that humanity's path had never been driven solely by those wielding pragmatic logic. Because from the earliest settlements on ancient Terra to the great empires that rose and fell across human civilization, mankind had always sought something more than base survival. Cultures separated by oceans, continents, and millennia repeatedly arrived at remarkably similar ideas: the existence of higher powers, moral order beyond the cruelty of nature ever present in the material world, and the belief that life possessed some meaning that transcended plain existence. There was never a single answer. Of course, religions changed, disappeared, gods came and went, but the impulse to believe in some unifying divine force endured. Except in the period where humanity apparently transcended such ideas, and this is why I often wonder if the Emperor was attempting to just recapture something of that era and then go in a different direction, adherent to his own plan for humanity to ascend into this psychic race. But to someone such as Lorgar, who had seen firsthand how necessary faith was during his formative years upon Colchis, this was never something that could just be dismissed as fearful ignorance. It was an intrinsic part of what it meant to be human. The Emperor evidently appeared to believe otherwise, but whether he genuinely underestimated this impulse or just sought to suppress it until humanity had reached a point where it could safely confront then the reality of the warp remains in strict law terms one of the great unanswered questions. Certainly, his long-term vision demanded a species capable of reason before spiritual revelation, mental discipline ahead of worshipping raw power. Yet from the perspective of the word-bearers, such distinctions barely mattered, because from their perspective, the imperial truth was asking humanity to deny a fundamental aspect of its own nature, and history had repeatedly demonstrated that such previous attempts rarely endured. And this is why the destruction of Monarchia was doomed in providing any meaningful consequence, instead leading down an opposite pathway of catastrophic result. From the Emperor's perspective, it was just symbolic, believing that for his Astartes, they should be able to emotionally disconnect the reality and see that the city itself was not just merely reduced to ash, it was this fundamental idea of what it represented being destroyed also. But Lorgar had truly believed that faith could exist in harmony with the tenets of the new Imperium, that reason and religion might ultimately serve the same purpose. After Monarchia, all he had left was the realization that perhaps the object of his worship had always been something else. So I think you could argue that Lorgar didn't really become a traitor in the sense we understand that relative to his brother Primarchs, because when he approached the Eye of Terror, he was seeking more than answers. Really, he was seeking validation of himself and his belief. It wasn't about turning his back on the Emperor or even abandoning the imperial truth. It was simply about revelation. He clearly had not yet discovered the true divine form he was set to worship, and there was a sense of purity in what he sought. This may also be why the word-bearers, after even 10,000 years, remained so unshakable, because while the other legions were seduced by promises of power, vengeance or immorality, the word-bearers shared the convictions of their Primarch. Their new crusade was not one which sought to simplistically overthrow a despotic leader, as did Horus and the others. Their quest was far more personal. They viewed the heresy as a sacred obligation to tear down a lie and replace it with what they now believed was the true order of the galaxy and existence itself. And I think that position may well be proven when over the 10,000 years that followed, the Imperium slowly transformed into something the Emperor had sworn to prevent. The imperial truth disintegrated, emergent cults of Emperor worship steadily became formalized until they had to be legally acknowledged. Thus, the Emperor's truth became buried under layers of ritual dogma and blind faith. In time, the ecclesiarchy became one of the most powerful institutions in human history. Trillions worship the god Emperor, and now the language through which much of humanity understood their own existence is through the imperial religion. This was not the future the Emperor had sought to build. It was, however, remarkably close to the future Lorgar had envisioned and predicted. What other legion can say they came anywhere near to predicting, laying the groundwork, and finally seeing their plans come to such immense fruition? This does also explain why the word-bearers remained one of the most coherent of all the traitor legions, for while many of their brothers emerged fractured physically and mentally beyond all recognition, the word-bearers remained more united by a common doctrine. There were fractures, of course, notably between Cor Ferron and Erebus, who remained two of Lorgar's closest contemporary advisors, but what enabled them to remain so focused whilst others around them fragmented was their scripture, their hierarchy, such as the Dark Apostles, who fulfill much the same role that chaplains now do for the Imperium, preaching, interpreting doctrine, and ensuring ideological unity, even where military unity might prove otherwise impossible. So the Legion remains governed by the Dark Council upon Sikaris, preserving an organisational structure almost unheard of amongst the traitor legions, but which very comically has an organisational structure which is quite comparable to many of the Loyalist chapters. So this continuity is what best explains the true identity of the word-bearers, to my mind anyway, And I think it's why they remain so dangerous in the current age. Because essentially since Monarchia, every campaign and cult they established continued to just embellish and renew their faith in the primordial truth. 10,000 years has not diminished their convictions, and where other legions warbands saw their greater ambitions diminished to the likes of territorial acquisition, capturing Imperials for whatever abhorrent purpose, or just raiding planets to replenish resources, the Wordbearers remained more insidious, planning objectives that would significantly undermine Imperial strongholds, or searching for key relics that could unleash hellish powers, far more grandiose than crates of bolt-arounds. And certainly whilst others still engage in combat that sees them attempt to overwhelm the great Imperial enemy through brutality and force, the Sons of Lorgar are considerably more patient. They may spend entire decades before the first Astartes of the 17th are even ever sighted. They have missionaries, cult leaders, corrupted preachers and hidden covens which take root in a population. Nobles and planetary governors, surrounded by their whispering advisors, find themselves unwittingly subverted, even as the ever-desperate populace are offered certainty amidst the growing darkness that is the Imperium in M41. And again, like the Tyranids, it is often the unwashed masses rising up to overthrow or disrupt an Imperial world that is the hallmark of a word-bearer incursion, so that by the time they're finally revealed, the conflict may be all but decided, as neighbour turns upon neighbour, convinced they're fighting for salvation rather than damnation. And the ability to exploit that weakness is something the Wordbearers understood more clearly than perhaps any among their fellow legions, that a conflict can be won often more effectively by hollowing it out from within. Whatever strength is present in its armies and industries, it's turning a population to become willing participants in their own downfall, which ensures fanatical obedience, and something that easily translates, of course, to religious conviction. But there is the caveat of, if you have the time to spare to do all that, which often a smaller warband engaged on lethal strike missions simply does not have. The Wordbearers' battle doctrine is quite well established. In the Dark Apostle trilogy, for example, they do not simply prosecute campaigns of broad extermination, although they still have pretty solid engagements. The protagonist and host move through the galaxy as conquerors of spirit just as much as the physical, because there's always an underlying spiritual objective for any Wordbearer campaign alongside the material one. They seek the establishment of devices, constructs or locations which will enable the further worship of the Dark Gods long after they're gone, and this remains equally true in the contemporary Indomitus era. The only significant known home planet of the Wordbearers in this age is Sikaros. This is the planet where Lorgar sought sanctuary after the Heresy. Its surface is covered in temple complexes and monuments dedicated, of course, to the ruinous powers. Above ground, demons and warp engines scramble and clamber across its structures. Underground, its population exists in a state of subterranean nightmare and endless dark worship. Its largest structure is the Basilica of the Word, a vast cathedral which towers over all other, and atop its spires lie writhing impaled bodies of the sacrificial offerings to Chaos. Deep within its chambers are the Dark Council, but Lorgar himself resides in the Templum Inficio. This rises in isolation from the desert of Sikaros, much like Colchis he knew back home. It is a temple washed in the blood of the millions who constructed it, and within its walls remains the Primarch in a state of self-imposed isolation for basically 10,000 years. Lorgar's state of mind and intentions remain unknown, so we're left to determine the current operations of the Legion from its known engagements. To that end, one of my favourite novels of this period is second in the Dawn of Fire series. I've mentioned it before, The Gate of Bones, because this presents us with Guilliman seeking the securement of the planet Gathalamor. Yet those tasked with holding the line here soon discover that the ongoing conflict the planet is drowning in was not simply an attack upon a strategically important shrine world, but a far more grandiose, dark attempt to strike at the Imperium itself. It also has great interactions with Sorotas and Custodes, and we see how an ordinary cult member can be raised to become an apprentice of the traitor Astartes. Highly recommend. I probably should also note the fourth in that series, Throne of Light, because that sees a Wordbearer's invasion led by Cor Phaeron, and he seeks to weaken the Imperium's ability to sustain itself by disrupting the Black Ships, thereby threatening the Emperor's supply of psychers, while simultaneously triggering uprisings and cult activity across regions already strained by the Rift itself. The Dawn of Fire series, not every novel's a banger, but I definitely recommend those two, at least. So in many ways, the Wordbearers never really altered their modus operandi because they had no need to. They still seek to convert planets, just as they did in the Crusade. They champion faith and belief, just as they did in the Crusade. The only thing that's changed is the polarized switch from Emperor to the Warp Gods. And I think this also explains why Lorgar's relative absence has never diminished the Legion. They continue to launch campaigns from Sikaris. The Dark Council dictates operations and ensures that coherence remains, even as internal rivalries still exist between Erebus and Kor Pharon. The Wordbearers under Lorgar never truly required his presence because they just understand what must be done, and they can carry this out as a lone individual, warband or fleet. And lastly, I will just say the other reason I think the Wordbearers are so interesting to consider is the fact that within the setting of Warhammer 40,000, one of its core points of focus, which I don't think gets enough attention, surrounds the soul, be that alien or human. These are not just metaphors for consciousness or morality, they're considered to be quite tangible things. I've discussed before, if you look at descriptions of an Eldari or Drakari soul, they seem to be more resilient, quite different to that of humans. They can be detached and reattached. This is why Eldar used to be reborn, because their soul upon death would remove itself from the body and then reattach itself. Whereas most human souls just dissolve into the ether unless it's a very powerful mind or that of a psyker. This is why we have this idea of gods in the warp collecting souls and torturing them over time, because a soul can quite literally be possessed, consumed by demons, bound into machines, imprisoned within artifacts, even preserved beyond death. It is the nature of the warp. Every human life casts a reflection into the immaterium, and collectively those souls generate the tides of the warp itself. And the reason this is worth noting is that this idea is something the Wordbearers clearly understand, and that faith and belief in M41 are not just, as Malcador said, the fearful looking for meaning to cling on to. It's far more than that, and it carries a very real metaphysical weight. And it's been demonstrated time and again, be it traitor or loyalist, that faith becomes this force capable of influencing reality itself. And that is, after all, basically the foundation of the Sororitas and their powers. The difference is that while the Imperium views the soul as something to be protected or consumed by the Emperor, the servants of chaos like the Night Lords see it more akin to a currency to be spent in exchange for power. The Wordbearers occupy a position, I think, somewhere in between that. They see the soul as something to be cultivated. A soul can be weak, but it can be empowered or made more resilient. And when you think of how Wordbearers try to consume and corrupt Imperial planets, basically I think the best way to imagine that is they are sowing the seeds of chaos and then they harvest the souls for the gods of chaos. With every conversion, sermon, swelling mass of worshippers, the dark gods take notice, and their rewards for those who understand what they desire, that harvest of souls, can of course be limitless. And there's an intriguing paradox to consider, that while the Chaos Gods undoubtedly feed upon raw emotion, the strength and the volume of that needed to satisfy the entities of the warp is very fleeting. So you have, for example, again, Night Lords maybe flaying thousands of individuals, but all of that stuff is very momentary. So whilst these other traitor legions understand just at a very base level that insane levels of cruelty and suffering enable them a minor embellishment of power, I think the Wordbearers came to realise long ago that something far more powerful is the endurance of faith, and also what that soul looks like before it gets harvested by the warp. Because that strength of faith can found entire civilizations, it can span generations, it can become a core focus for life, thereby becoming one of the most stable forms of empowerment for the warp, not dissimilarly to how the Imperial religion appears to have been powering the Emperor. The only thing left for me to really mention with the Wordbearers is again Lorgar himself. He's been absent for the past 10,000 years since the Heresy, yet rumours persist about his return. And I know I've said before now that Primarchs coming back, it doesn't particularly excite me. Lorgar's return is very exciting to me, because of all of the Primarchs, in my mind, he should be returning as the most powerful. And I would like that switch up. I would like it where he's gone from in the Heresy being kind of shunned by his brothers, a bit seen as a bit more weak and incapable than them, and he comes back as this demigod figure because of everything they've been doing across 10,000 years. But no matter what form he really takes, just the emergence of the Demon Primarchs has really transformed the landscape of the 41st millennium. You've got Mortarion spreading pestilence across entire sectors, Angron drowning systems in blood. But I think Lorgar's emergence really should represent something different, because it's difficult to speculate what kind of figure he would be like in terms of his objectives. His greatest weapon has never been military strength, but it's this position as leader of the Wordbearers, that force which arguably contributed more than any other legion. He should emerge as a figure that truly all of the gods of chaos undivided should be rallying behind. And were he to emerge as such, and pour his vast force of the Legion into the objectives of smaller warbands, or the likes of Abaddon's quests, it would be easy to see how terrifyingly significant that could alter the landscape of M41. Not to mention the fact that it would set up a reckoning once more between the most bitter of rivals, to see Lorgar and Guilliman face off once more, each carrying with them their unresolved resentment, their hatred for Monarchia and Calth respectively, and two vast armies coming together. How I pray for the day we get a new campaign that sees the Ultramarines and Wordbearers once more engage in a full, unrestrained total war. Then next we turn to the far less prophetic and far more practical masters of grinding attritional warfare, the Iron Warriors. Similarly though to the Wordbearers, the Iron Warriors retain one of the more significant levels of unity among the Traitor Legions. They excel in the planning and execution of sieges, and in essence they can be best summarised as being consumed by bitterness and envy. And I guess that could be said for all the Traitors, but think of it and then more. The Iron Warriors, alongside their demon Primarch Perturabo, who of course survived the Heresy, remain resilient and committed utterly to demonstrating their superiority and eclipsing their other legions in the grand campaign of galactic conquest. But before we look at the contemporary, during the Siege of Terra there was of course significant argumentation about how best to succeed in defeating the Loyalists. The decisions of those final days have remained a permanent scar among those who orchestrated the doomed assault on Terra. I think none more so than, of course, the Iron Warriors Primarch Perturabo, who approached the Siege of Terra as an entirely military problem, but became increasingly frustrated and contemptuous by his brothers who seemed incapable of maintaining discipline. Angron had become this barely controllable engine of destruction. Fulgrim and the Emperor's children just pursued their own appetites, and Mortarion remained committed to the war but had been fundamentally transformed by Nurgle and was very likely being pulled in different intentional directions. Magnus was just doing his own goals, bound in his own personal history, and Lorgar had already attempted to challenge Horus stupidly before the siege and failed abysmally, so was effectively banished from the Warmaster's presence. The end result of all this was Perturabo very irritated and reportedly arguing for control over the siege to ensure a more methodical prosecution of the siege, which was very necessary, not to mention also being able to effectively play his game against Dawn, which he very much wanted to do. The only major problem was that the time for him to have been most effective had passed. The war was becoming an increasingly warp-saturated conflict, thus conventional strategy ever less relevant. And by the closing days of the siege, reality itself on Terra was just beginning to unravel. And so, as he said himself, Horus has given this battle to sorcerers and beasts. The war of legions is over. Mortarion comes here to take this place. He and what he has become is what this war is now. And so, with little more thought to the matter, Perturabo ordered the Iron Warriors' withdrawal, even as Horus gave Mortarion more control amid the growing dominance of demonic warfare, because Perturabo just saw that no longer was this a war that he could give any meaningful input to. and especially when he was instructed to essentially throw his legion just into the midst and engage in a strategy which he saw was doomed to fail and just absolutely slaughter his own legion. He just said no and got the hell out of there. Because also at that point Fulgrim had abandoned the main assault after his confrontation with Dawn, Mortarion was soon to be banished by the Khan, and while Horus possessed extraordinary individual tools of war going into the siege, by now everything was falling apart, and increasingly they were really struggling to wield anything approaching a coherent army. It was just a mash of slaughter and hatred. And weakened as the Loyalists may have been, certainly the tide was turning, and Perturabo likely saw this way before anybody else. So he withdrew from the Heresy, understanding that they needed enough power to survive the oncoming wrath that would follow the siege in the form of surviving Loyalists. So they retreated to their flagship, the Iron Blood, near Mars, where Perturabo watched the final stages of the siege. Following Horus's death, he remained on the edge of the Sol system as the traitors fled before the terrifying weight of Guilliman's incoming fleet. But when the Wordbearers attempted to rekindle Chaos power through a warp device on a moon of Neptune, Perturabo stepped in, effectively saying, "Enough is enough," crushed them with no intention of continuing their hopeless war on Terra, and I think in some respects he ensured the Wordbearers remained as strong as they are in M41 by basically pulling them out of there. Because without that intervention it's possible, and likely they would have been completely obliterated by the Ultramarines. But after Terra, Perturabo was still thirsty for a more practical confrontation with Dawn that he had been denied during the siege. He sought to exact his revenge upon the Imperial Fists by constructing a trap. This was named the Eternal Fortress on Sebastus IV. Here he attempted to bait Rogul Dawn into fulfilling his promise to drag Perturabo back to Terra in an iron cage. And Dawn, perhaps, if not definitely, naively, expected some sort of honourable confrontation. This was not at all the case, as Perturabo cut the Imperial Fists off from their orbital support, divided their companies, and then proceeded to systematically destroy them across 20 miles of bunkers, trenches, and killing grounds. Those who finally reached its supposed centre discovered that there was no strategic central keep at all. The entire fortress existed simply to bleed them, until the surviving and now isolated Imperial Fists were reduced to using the bodies of the fallen as cover. It would take Guilliman and the Ultramarines to drive off the Iron Warriors, but the damage was done, and I would take the opportunity to yet again clown on the Imperial Fists, as this very obvious trap left Rogul Dawn an even more broken man than he already was after Terra, and rendered the Imperial Fist chapter essentially unable to fight for nearly 2 decades. Nicely done, Dawn. Oh, and just worth to mention on top of that humiliation, the gene seed of over 400 Imperial Fists sacrificed to the Dark Gods, and Perturabo elevated to the rank of Demon Prince of Chaos. All in all, quite a comical situation. But I think that's a pretty good summary of the end of the Heresy in terms of the Iron Warriors, and sets them up middle into M41. So by the coming of the Great Rift and the dawning of the Era Indomitus, the Imperium quivers under the unrelenting strain of its countless conflicts. Its strength has been stretched to breaking point as never before, and amid the increasingly desperate attempts to hold back the tides of chaos, those who had lain in wait for so long now see opportunity. Abaddon was wreaking havoc, as had Mortarion in Ultramar. But what of Perturabo? Well, he, of course, also saw this opportunity to prove his intellectual martial superiority over his brother Primarchs, but more importantly, to deal a decisive blow to the Imperium that could leave them absolutely crippled and perhaps unable to recover. But before we think about that, much had changed since the Crusade, of course. While the Emperor required many different kinds of generals, Horus with his charisma to unite armies, Guilliman to govern empires, the inspiration aura of Sanguinius, Perturabo possessed a different gift entirely. He was unique save for perhaps Guilliman in his ability to understand war as few others could, but where the Lord of Ultramar was an academic and tactician, and Dawn the master of fortification, the best description for Perturabo was that he could always see how defences ceased to be an obstacle, how to undermine supply chains, the most efficient firing solutions, where there were geological weaknesses none had realised, and perhaps most critically of all, how to ensure logistical endurance for his own forces. All of these things were like a language for him to interpret and speak without ever having to think about it. It was instinctive, it was coded into him. His only variables were time, resources, and manpower. And unlike some of his brothers, Perturabo did not seek an elegant victory. He was pragmatic and accepting of losses. He knew what victory would cost and would pay the price once his calculations were made. Some objectives demanded sacrifice on an extraordinary scale, but these were sacrifices he expected his legion to endure. It was simply what was required to shatter others. I think the best comparison would be obviously the warriors of Krieg. The Iron Warriors are in some respects the Krieg in Astartes form, which is just about as terrifying as it sounds. But this earned the Iron Warriors an unforgiving reputation throughout the Crusade. Their campaigns were methodical, leading their wars of attrition instead of masterful, heroic charges, tactical insertions. Their only purpose was to finish the task at hand, assess the damage, and move on. They bore the losses as a badge of honour, for with their understanding and acceptance of this, they were well regarded as being one of the most unbreakable legions. But of course, this shaped the culture of the Legion itself, and that continued through into M41. The Iron Warriors were increasingly pragmatic, they placed competence above ceremony and results above reputation, while the Loyalists love their ceremony, their honours, badges, their names on walls and banners. For the Iron Warriors, all of that became not only something to view with disdain, but something almost viewed with suspicion. This level of self-serving indulgence was to be enjoyed by those who put themselves above the fundamental actions and meaning of their engagements. Whereas the sons of Perturabo came to see themselves as labourers of war. They were the ones to be called upon whenever impossible work had to be completed. They marked the mission, completed, and moved on to the next battlefield. And I cannot lie, but no need to make any messages to Inquisitor or agents you may have come into contact with, but I really like the Iron Warriors for this. It's what I imagine an Astartes should be. Not all the fluff and the pomp and circumstance. They just destroy whatever is in front of them, and then they move on, without comment. Mission complete. Clean the armour. Next target. None of the chit-chat, the conversation, the rationalisation, the philosophy, the verses, the historitors, the remembrancers, all the guilt and the dress-up. They're just pure war and grinding achievement. Now, saying all that, at the same time, you have to consider the fact that Perturabo possessed qualities that magnified every perceived slight. His pride was immense, his competitiveness relentless, and his capacity for resentment almost without equal amongst his brothers. Where moments of praise might have just satisfied another Primarch, these were entirely insufficient for Perturabo. He didn't need those vast ceremonies which the Imperium loved to indulge in, but he did require respect and recognition for his legion's expertise, especially in comparison to others like Dawn's. Therefore, the endless comparisons with the 7th Legion became yet another wound. Any glorious triumphs not entirely attributed to the Iron Warriors, shared or otherwise, became further evidence that the Imperium valued appearance more than substance. This drip of contempt grew and grew. But I still don't think in the case of Perturabo that it was all about this lack of recognition. I think it was more subtle, in the sense that over time what qualified as appreciation ceased to satisfy him. It felt more and more just like lip service, when they needed more than that. Not just the gold and ceremonial fluff that was equally irrelevant for them, it needed to be more personal than this, from his brothers, and most of all, of course, probably, the Emperor. And I don't think that's unreasonable either. His genius demanded acknowledgement proportionate to the position which he understood himself to occupy. So when that acknowledgement consistently failed to materialise in the way he believed that it should, the bitterness and resentment slowly consumed him, until it became the only lens through which he was able to consider every command issued to him. And perhaps this is why the Iron Warriors remained one of the easiest legions to misunderstand. Their bitterness did not just emerge suddenly, and it can't be explained entirely through that sense of just unjust disregard for them. But that sense of resentment did eventually become so strong that it was the foundation which the Legion came to understand itself and how it related to the Imperium both during and post-Crusade. And understanding that, it's easy to see how in 10,000 years of their retreat to the Eye of Terror, that sense of resentment consumed them and forged them into what is near enough now an entire civilization of hate. And as I've said so many times, the Traitor Legions descended into increasingly chaotic collections of rival warbands, but the Sons of Perturabo retained much of themselves in their shared beliefs. They did not collapse, because Perturabo stepped in to save them before it reached that point. They were not broken as were so many others, and that meant they retained that Crusade-era military discipline and industrial culture which defines them. Their planet of Medrengard wasn't just a refuge, it was an unbreakable bastion world, a fortress factory, and within its manufactories, foundries, lie the unspeakably tortured populations subjected to basically becoming cogs in a planetary scale machine devoted to sustaining endless war. Something Demonculaba, check out Dead Sky Black Sun. In M41, Perturabo now views the Imperium as a single fortress, and Terra is its central keep. But rather than repeating Horus's catastrophic rush towards the throne world, he intends to prosecute the greatest siege in history. This is his grand vision that he refers to as the Infinite Citadel, which would transform entire planets into interconnected fortress systems supported by the Dark Mechanicum, demon engines, and the power of the Rift itself. This plan came into being through centuries of observation, reconnaissance, raids, and the capture and interrogation of loyalists. Now the Iron Warriors have forged alliances with elements of the Alpha Legion, but more importantly, they established infernal pacts with demonic entities, most notably the Lord of Demon Engines, Vashtor the Arcaphane, who gifted to Perturabo a bounty of data regarding Imperial defences. And despite remaining within the heart of his fortress on Medrengard, Perturabo and the Warsmiths of the Grand Companies now wage war anew, as every conquest strengthens this network, extending it ever closer to the Sol system, until one day he plans to exact the victory stolen from him by the self-serving agendas of his brother during the siege and the unreality that made his mastery of war all but impossible. In the current era, Perturabo has begun already to initiate that new campaign, first by returning to Cadia and overwhelming the forces left behind by Abaddon to mine for Blackstone, thereafter pushing onward into systems where he seeks to secure the critical world of Agrippina. But no matter where, the Iron Warriors approach warfare with the same expectation that resistance is no obstacle, only something to be systematically crushed. They run a calculated playbook of orbital bombardment, artillery, and then a wider ground assault designed to strip away fortifications, communication, and concentrations of enemy troops, units, hardware. Should Traitor Titans or other heavy assets be available, all the better. Their weapons are simply concentrated into a barrage until the enemy further collapses under their saturation bombardment, none of which is about the spectacle or to destroy morale as is typical with Titans. Even if that does occur, the objective is to reduce the enemy to the point they're exhausted and isolated even before the battle proper has begun. But the Iron Warriors are known for their ability to fortify as well, hence their comparisons so often to their nemesis Legion, and will rapidly establish bunkers, temporary strongpoints to create positions to methodically fall back if necessary and have time to then re-engage. This can also force their enemy to expend disproportionate numbers in any counter-offensive, even as the Legion's strength is concentrated elsewhere in an encircling manoeuvre. When any enemy is sufficiently weakened, spearheads drive headlong into their sectors, absolutely shattering them to ensure any final assault will utterly collapse an enemy. The overall goal, though, is a sustained procedural flaying, which strips the defences of the enemy layer by layer, much like the deflagrating effect of a Volkite weapon, so that by the time the Legion advances, the enemy has already watched its cities burn and its armies be cut to shreds. A clear breach in enemy defence lines will be filled by Iron Warrior veterans who deploy to test and infiltrate that opening before further concentrated firepower rips it wide open to allow heavy armour to surge forth. Just for the sake of saying it, any Iron Warriors unit will be prepared for whatever eventuality, be it close quarter or ranged, and as ever, the Legion will commit itself with a cold ferocity, withdrawing as soon as their objective is secured, never wishing to lose critical momentum that can be exploited by an enemy still reeling for their most recent loss, and so that they can immediately re-engage and keep pressing the advance. Hence their preference for overwhelming weaponry. Example, the Iron Warriors enjoy utilising so-called obliterator cults because their corrupted malformed monstrosities reinforce their battle doctrine, seeing armour and firepower supersede the value of whoever carries them. Mutilators also are a particular favourite to be used. There are some notable figures also among the Iron Warriors, just as in the Word Bearers, like Honsu, Foryx, Valen and Shontu, but overall their exploits are not comparable really to someone like Erebus or Corferon, because it's more about battle endeavours with the Iron Warriors, leadership, that kind of thing. So I think it's moreover beneficial to just understand what it means to be a Warsmith within the Iron Warriors and what that rank means. Essentially, during the Heresy for Perturabo, as we've covered, the Iron Warriors were treated as this single instrument of war, and surprisingly, comparative to the other legions, who often saw the heritage of their Astartes cause divisions when the Primarch joined them. With the Iron Warriors, there was no real distinction called out between those of Terran origin and those who came later. That issue didn't really arise, and that's because to Perturabo, all of his legionnaires were valuable in terms of what their lives could purchase on the battlefield. Additional competence in logistics, technology or siegecraft added to the application of force, which could be applied to any strategic advancement. And that concept is what will become embodied by the Warsmiths. They were individuals who largely replaced the role of praetors and lord commanders that are seen among the other legions at that time. Because rather than being a more arbitrary senior command, a Warsmith was expected to master the complete machinery of warfare, from planetary campaigns, supply networks to artillery, optimizing squad fields of fire. Perturabo held them personally responsible for victory or failure, and so inevitably, the system produced ruthless, fiercely independent commanders whose out-of-field rivalries could be very intense, and even encouraged. Most Warsmiths would lead grand battalions or specialized formations across the Legion. Above them stood three favoured Warsmiths who held the rank of Triarch. They formed the Trident, nominally Perturabo's advisors, who served as direct instruments through which the Primarch would impose his will upon the Legion. By M41, the title of Warsmith had become something you might equate to an Iron Warrior's Chaos Lord, because they stand as the absolute masters of the Legion, still wielding their own grand company, which for a Chaos Force in M41 is a terrifying scale of command. The composition will be immense, and some combination of whatever fortresses they have the power to control across various worlds. They will have a large void fleet, huge numbers of Astartes and material hardware, and likely some number of demon engines, as well as other lesser officers of trust that they've accumulated across 10,000 years of conflict. Critically, the expectations of technical and strategic mastery remain, in spite of the fact that the Legion, which once gave the title meaning, has long since disintegrated. Now, the rank is held by those who really deserve it. For anyone deemed not carrying the experience or expertise to call themselves a Warsmith would risk a challenge from those who serve beneath them, and very likely that challenge would be terminal. So the Iron Warriors have retained such immense weight of power in their own Legion, they see little need to kneel before the power of the warp. It's not to say this never happens, but by its very nature, using the warp incurs high amounts of risk. Demons are tricky creatures to be bound into engines, and while warp energies are a source of power, it's well known to be unstable, hence unreliable, not something particularly favoured by the Iron Warriors, because reliability is the core of their battle doctrine. Instead, what you might call their true faith is cast in the iron certainty of calculating what is required to deliver a victory with overwhelming force. This is what Perturabo teaches. The Dark Mechanicum therefore remain a key ally, and this has given the Legion ever more terrible ways of forcing the Immaterium into material form and putting it to work. But these are merely useful tools. The Iron Warriors would always place themselves as the driving spearhead in any campaign. Now, whether Perturabo, like Lorgar, was always destined to betray the Imperium can never be answered with certainty, but the consequence is all apparent in his design of a civilization which manufactures materials to sustain their perpetual war, where every fortress exists to build another, and where every campaign is an assured victory that then lays the groundwork for the next. In the era Indomitus, the Iron Warriors remain, unlike many others, a remarkably recognisable reflection of the Legion that existed during the Great Crusade. Their grand companies still operate independently, yet share the Legion heritage of unified siegecraft. They still engage in war through industrial-scale attrition, all underscored by the ever-present, seething contempt for human weakness. Medrungard stands as the dark, unassailable pearl at the centre of Perturabo's dominion, for he has spent millennia gathering the necessary preparations to leave nothing to chance, running endless simulations of potential scenarios until the single remaining solution stood clear. The fall of Cadia and the emergence of the Great Rift presented an irresistible opportunity not seen for 10,000 years. And so he has now begun, through his plan of the Infinite Citadel, to begin a campaign that will utterly crush the Imperium. Its galactic system of defences will be isolated, weakened and systematically dismantled until the siege lines eventually reach Terra, just as he pragmatically dismantled the Imperial Fists in the shadow of the Heresy. And these plans are nothing to be underestimated either, for even Eldrad Ulthran of the Eldari Ulthwé craft world, seer and unofficial advisor to Rabute Gilliman, has sensed with great unease the unfolding campaign of Iron, and is deeply troubled by the opening assault from Perturabo. He reflected that it may be only the involvement of his people who can now save the Imperium. 10,000 years after the abject humiliation of the Heresy, the Lord of Iron still pursues the war that only he sees with a clarity beyond all others. His final and definitive siege will not be conducted amid the complicating, twisted, bitter rivalries of his brothers, nor overshadowed by any warmaster. He has chosen the time and the place, and he retains the plan that will finally see his great enemy crushed. There is no need to rush though, no intention to move too aggressively. The march toward Terra is one of slow and calculated siegecraft. Perturabo desires what he always intended to seek from the Heresy, the calm satisfaction of observing his mastery, his legion pitted against the best the Imperium can offer, the master of war against the greatest fortress humanity has ever built. Perturabo plans to dismantle it methodically and completely until nothing remains. So as we come to a close, next time we will continue on with an exploration of two more iconic legions, although I think iconic only for people who are already deep into 40k, the Night Lords and the Alpha Legion. Plus this gives me a good opportunity to reread the entire Night Lords trilogy, which I haven't done for a while. To restate, the core takeaway whenever it comes to any Undivided Legion is that when they were driven into exile, they did not surrender in the same way. Their ambitions were never wholly given to a single divine master, and for that reason their own perspectives, drives and outward philosophies continued to matter, which is what makes them so interesting. The Long War could have been nothing more than an endless campaign of consistent, grinding vengeance, but instead it became an opportunity for each legion to decide what they should preserve from the ashes of the Heresy. The Wordbearers saw in Horus's failure no reason to abandon their faith, only a confirmation that they were right to have exited the whole situation, and further proof that the long war would ultimately be won not through open engagements and massive campaigns, but in the corruption of humanity itself, which remains their goal. The Iron Warriors similarly abandoned the dream of empire, but even upon exiting the Heresy, were never in any doubt whatsoever that they had already proved their worth and knew their value. Their entrenched beliefs remained that strength is earned through relentless endurance, and this would be proven to them evermore across the coming 10,000 years. Across that span of existence, all of these answers have continued to evolve. The Undivided have fought beside one another, against one another, and pursued entirely separate conflicts. Unlike the great hosts devoted to Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch or Slaanesh, they have never allowed what the gods desired of them to define their reality. Because chaos is never their master, but it does enable their designs upon the great empire of humanity. What remained of the legions in some respects was that they had now outlived the purpose they were created to serve. If nothing else, this highlights why it seems a certainty that none of the Astartes, loyalist or otherwise, were likely designed to live past the Crusade, and I think this is still very likely that the Emperor decided to destroy them all at some point because he knew that their existence was effectively incompatible with what he had planned for humanity. My final thought when it comes to the Wordbearers is that they may be the only legion capable of delivering a possible future for chaos itself. Because whilst chaos is extraordinarily powerful, its power is perpetually squandered through the great game between the gods themselves. Chaos is, without sounding stupid, chaotic. It's just a maelstrom of conflict between itself as much as its enemies. The Wordbearers have the potential to genuinely unify at least some of that power through their religious hierarchy, their scripture rituals, their conception of humanity's relationship with chaos being beyond personal ascension, personal power and enrichment. And that might sound far-fetched, but remember, they've basically done it once already in the Imperium by causing the development of their entire theocratic structure. But the key to all of that is, of course, Lorgar. It's far from impossible to imagine a wave of a new religion that could conflict with the ecclesiarchy emerging. A new then vast war takes hold in the Dark Imperium and threatens to spread to Imperium Sanctus, perhaps with one key component championing the Flood, Lorgar. And I've thought about this often. It's what makes his potential return particularly interesting, because if and when that happens, his actual immediate goals may have little to do with personally defeating Guilliman or leading yet another assault upon Terra, which would be inevitably doomed to fail and at this point just quite trite. Instead, I would love to see Lorgar attempt something Chaos has rarely sustained on a galactic scale, turning its countless cults, warbands, corrupted hive populations into something resembling a new civilization of chaos. It would certainly grind additional salt into the wound of Guilliman of demonstrating, hey look, we can do this just as well as you. Imagine Lorgar having his own polar opposite to Ultramar. The Wordbearers already possess much of the ideological machinery required to achieve that, and what would follow is Chaos beginning to secure something that it's never really had, which is acquiring permanence in the Materium. Imagine populations converted rather than simply being sacrificed, generations raised knowing nothing except the primordial truth. The Imperium and the Emperor in their eyes are as despicable and hated as the gods of the warp to humanity. We already know that humanity is an enormously psychic species as well, albeit much of it latent, and whose emotions and souls interact with the warp. So then thinking about that, if Lorgar's view that all human cultures need to imbue their existence with spiritual meaning, achieving this kind of mass civilization may be more easily achievable than the Imperium may like to think. And lastly, there could be great reason to do this, beyond just irritating Guilliman and challenging the religious status quo of the ecclesiarchy, because we know that seemingly faith and psychic emergence from the Great Rift has been empowering the Emperor. If you wanted to undo all of that and return the Emperor to his weakened state to the point of being barely aware of his own existence, what better way than to direct humanity's devotion, spirit and soul toward the warp and chaos and away from the Emperor, starve him of his spiritual fuel. The Iron Warriors effectively suggest the opposite future. While the warp can produce ethereal horrors and impossible weapons, they do not endure, and they rarely conquer. Wars still require, in the material sense, ammunition, ships, facilities, fortresses, labour and supply. The Iron Warriors understand these essential but mundane requirements better than any other servants of chaos, ready to make a significant play for the first time in 10 millennia. His infant citadel presents the disturbing possibility of unstoppable conquest, and they're reaching toward a reshaping of imperial territorial architecture. He is ready to exploit the fact that the Imperium has spent 10,000 years squandering, sliding into stagnant, ritualized ignorance, even as Perturabo remained sharp of mind, obsessive, inventive, and willing to use any means necessary, even the powers of the warp, to achieve his objectives. Their initial campaign was reasonably successful, and should they gain ground with any consistency, then the Iron Warriors may eventually come to represent a form of chaos that is horrifyingly efficient and pragmatic, not traits that you might typically associate with the followers of the warp. Their use of demon engines, dark mechanicum technology, supported by conventional industry, exist free of the theological restraints which bind the Mechanicus, something I think figures like Call are entirely aware of and realizing that there needs to be a significant change to. But the risk in doing that is of course triggering yet another civil war among the Mechanicus, and so in many respects the Imperium remains still paralysed in terms of what it needs to do, never able to build upon what once was, ensnared in their own bureaucratic internal problems and power struggles. No one to lead, no one to prepare for the coming inevitable retribution. The Imperium, it seems, learned little from the Heresy other than to always be on the back foot against the alien, the heretic, the insurgent, while Perturabo has spent that time thinking of nothing else than how to overcome his great enemy. And now they will soon discover what the Lord of Iron has learned from the failure upon Terra. It's been interesting again to think about the Iron Warriors and the Word Bearers today, and perhaps we could consider either of these for the next If They Controlled the Galaxy series. Who would you choose for me to speculate upon? The Word Bearers, suggesting humanity could become a spiritually converted new empire of chaos worship and what that would look like? The Iron Warriors taking a methodical approach to dismantle the physical structure of the Imperium, including its institutions, which would they keep, convert, twist, and replace them? And would Terra itself become another iteration of Medrengard? Which, not sure I want to think about that really. So I'll just say a big thanks for your support in this nightmare age of abominable intelligence. Please, as always, like the video, tell me your thoughts in the comments, and if you feel inclined, my Patreon is always there for general support. But other than that, I'll see you all, as always, in the next one.